If you're into retro games, then something you'll undoubtedly be interested in are arcade games. And if you're into collecting the games that you play, well, arcade games are kind of tricky because they were never sold to consumers in a mass market kind of way like home consoles were. They were giant arcade cabinets that you would find for the public to play in arcades or other various businesses. So, what's the best way to play them nowadays? Well, like most things, that is going to vary depending on what's important to you. And of course, the most authentic option is also the most expensive option, which is to buy the original cabinets and have them in your home. In a perfect world, you'd probably have a whole bunch of these cabinets in a giant room, all in working condition. And yes, there are a few select people who are able to do this, but that's obviously not the answer most of us want to hear, so we are going to look into many of the various other options. And many various other options there are indeed. Let's start with one of the most straightforward ways that will still satisfy that collector itch so many of us have, which is to of course just collect some of the home console ports. Now, of course, these home console ports will all vary in terms of how close they resemble the original arcade version, but in most cases you can find a pretty competent way to play these games. What you gotta remember is that the arcades were almost like movie theaters back in the day, where these games would eventually show up on home consoles later if they were deemed to be popular enough. You could even get a lot of the light gun games for home consoles and buy various light guns that you could use at home. Most, not all, but most of the best arcade games that we remember from back in the day received some sort of home port, if not multiple home ports. Funny enough, sometimes the best port isn't the most prominent or popular one. This is why I would heavily advise looking into what all the different port options for a given game are when deciding what to get, and don't forget about imports either. For example, Street Fighter II received some very popular and well-publicized ports on Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, but if you want a far more accurate port of the arcade version, you'll actually find it on the Sega Saturn or even the PS1. But even then, what's better could be debatable if the Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis version is what you grew up with, are used to, and therefore prefer. In fact, when comparing the original arcade version of a game to a given home port, it's not always cut and dry that the original arcade version is just going to be better by default. When games get ported to home consoles, the developers will often try to make some quality of life improvements in order to make the game a better package. And real quick, I'm not talking about some of the NES versions of arcade games that made changes, because in some of those cases, those are completely different games to the point that they should be treated as such. I think a good example of what I'm talking about would be a game like Turtles in Time, which not only made some tweaks to gameplay, but added some entirely new levels. As a result, some people consider this Super Nintendo version to be the definitive version, though not everybody, because after all, the original arcade version does have support for up to 4 players all at once, allowing 4 people to play as each of the 4 turtles at the same time, which is pretty cool to say the least. And while we're talking about Turtles in Time, I should quickly mention that there was an arcade cabinet made with the Turtles games on them by Arcade1Up for purchase as a brand new item. So yeah, that's one of the options for playing these arcade games as well. But that's not the only more modern solution for playing some of these older arcade games. There are compilations that have been released with some of these older arcade games on them as well. The one I like to bring up a lot is the Capcom Beat 'em Up bundle, which even has a couple of games on it that never received any kind of home port. Of course, even with that, there are still some Capcom Beat 'em Ups from back in the day that have never received any kind of home port, and a lot of these are actually games that use licensed properties. So yeah, the problem was obviously just getting a deal worked out with those licensed properties, which really sucks if you ask me. So what about those games that never received any kind of home port? And what about the arcade games that did receive home ports, but are different enough that we still want to play the original arcade versions anyway? Well, there are those Arcade1Up cabinets if you're lucky enough that the games you're interested in have been released by them, And of course there's always the original arcade cabinets themselves, but the most accessible option is, yep, you guessed it, the good old E-word. I know it can be kind of scary for some people, but it really is the easiest option. What I personally do is put the arcade games I'm interested in playing onto a Raspberry Pi, plug a USB arcade stick into it for the controller, plug it into my TV or monitor, and I'm off to the races. Now, I know that Raspberry Pis can be intimidating for some people to set up, but there are quite a few tutorial videos online that go through it very slowly and keep the instructions pretty straightforward. I like having mine set up to a basic display, but if you want, you can stick your Raspberry Pi inside of a tabletop arcade unit, or heck, even just a full-size or original arcade cabinet if you want to. This is actually a fairly common solution to the extent that the local arcade near me, yes, I'm fortunate enough to have one of those, will actually do this with some of their arcade cabinets in order to be able to offer more games. So there's a lot of room for customizing your setup, but one last setup I'd like to mention are Superguns and consoleized arcade hardware. These options are still quite expensive, but a good middle ground if you want to collect original arcade games without having the giant arcade cabinets taking up space in your home. The one that I have right here is actually a Neo Geo arcade board that has been consoleized. I chose this one because I'm a big fan of the Neo Geo, and I find the format that the games are in to be a little more wieldy in these enclosed cases than some of the other PCBs that you'll find for arcade games. Problem is, these types of units are often only available in limited quantities and custom made by enthusiasts. So they're certainly not for a mainstream audience, but I still felt like I should mention them. Alright, so that's a lot of options that I just went over. Let me know what your preference is when it comes to playing various arcade games, and if you don't really have one, let me know if this video has you leaning towards any specific option. So leave those comments down below as always, and I will see ya in the next video.